very sunny today, hence the jazzy shirt. Quick disclaimer just to open, but everything I mentioned in this video is alleged, and you should do your own research before you believe anything that I say. In 2018, an author called Raynor Winn published her debut memoir, The Salt Path. It recounts the story of Winn and her husband facing financial difficulties, homelessness, and on her husband's part, a fatal medical diagnosis, and how the couple allayed these dire circumstances by walking the southwest coast path in England, hence the Salt Path. Shortly after her now publisher Penguin began publishing the paperback, the book became the #1 best-selling book in independent UK bookstores, and less than a decade later has sold over 2 million copies. It was adapted into a film of the same name, and I suspect that it was ultimately this expansion outside the cultural realm of books that ultimately brought more eyes onto it, and perhaps brought more light onto the scrutiny and allegations that have been levied against Winn, specifically in an investigation by The Observer in 2025. What unraveled was that many of the people who had been featured as characters in The Salt Path, with their names changed but their identities still distinct, revealed strong convictions against what Winn had portrayed. Winn allegedly brought about those aforementioned financial difficulties, which trigger the memoir by embezzling money, which the memoir, of course, omits. What's more, Winn claims in the book that walking the salt path cured her husband of his fatal disease, something that medical experts question the entire basis of, and brings into question what has been told or omitted about that diagnosis also. I listened to The Observer's coverage of this, and I really recommend that if you haven't listened to it yet, you go and listen to it, because it's absolutely fascinating. If you search for The Walkers, The Real Salt Path, you'll find it. I will say that I have not read the memoir, but fortunately The Observer's journalism here is so robust that I don't think you need to in order to extrapolate the more interesting, wider industry implications, which is mostly what I'm here to talk about. My take after listening to the whole thing is that Chloe Hajimetheu at The Observer did an incredible job. I do think exaggeration and embellishment are the bulk of the issues at the heart of this memoir. And I also agree with her conclusion that a lot of this seems to stem from a kind of coping mechanism for Winn. In order to deal with all the difficult things that were happening in her life, she had to reframe events in a way that omitted her mistakes. And the only way to omit mistakes is to omit the truth. But whatever is true or not in the Salt Path is not the reason I'm making this video. But the second part of my title is, should we care? Or perhaps the more accurate question is, how much should we care? Because both fans and observers are going to form differing opinions on the lens with which a memoir should be viewed if the veracity of the work comes into question. The hard journalism of investigation into what is likely true or not true in Raynor Winn's book and books has been done to a degree that I, as a budding novelist, can basically add nothing. But I am making this video because I do want to talk about what those implications are for memoir as a genre. First, to touch on legality, it is not illegal to market a book as a memoir and lie in it, but it is ethically unsound. In any kind of analysis here, we have to be openly frank and honest that memoir as a genre of literature basically cannot be expected to exist without embellishment in some form. When we're talking about our own lives, it is difficult, if not practically impossible, to be objective in every sense. Part of the point of a memoir is that it is about a series of events in one's life, and so in more cases than not, inextricably wrapped in and coloured by the emotions of the author. I don't think a modern reading audience is interested in reading a memoir that doesn't have an emotive narrative driving it, because then why read memoir and not simply broader non-fiction? My logical conclusion here is that when we're talking about memoir, we're not being wholly objective in what we're doing here, are we? As a reader, that is not what we're primarily interested in. What we're interested in is being told an engaging story that is, at least in someone's perspective, true. So this begs the question, does Raynor Winn believe that she is telling the truth? This, of course, is close to impossible for us to answer, But it does also raise the question of, does she know truths that she has willfully chosen to omit? And I think the Observer's investigation has roundly proved that that was much easier to answer. Getting into the weeds of this is necessary because we're getting into ethical territory. How many times does an author need to lie or omit, and how big do those lies or omissions need to be for the memoir to no longer be a memoir? It's a very Ship of Theseus-like question, which again doesn't have any particular practical answer, but it is interesting. One of the things that the Observer noted in their investigation that honestly came as no surprise to me, but which I expect did come as a surprise to some of the people listening to the podcast, is that coverage of this scandal has tainted Raynor Winn's image, but it's done basically nothing to suppress sales. In fact, I believe it's done the opposite. I hope I never take this advice on board for myself, but if you want to sell a lot of books, I think we're living in an age where you're more likely to do so not by writing the book well, but by getting embroiled in scandal. The Salt Path's publisher, Penguin, have done very little upon learning these allegations. In fact, in their statement, they described all this investigative journalism as intrusive conjecture, which I cannot help but say with a grin, because I'm going to be entering this industry very shortly, and that assertion strikes me as woefully dismissive to the point of naked commercial bias. So how's this? Let's take the position, hypothetically, of doing Winn the benefit of any doubt. What can we say of the evidence we have that shows anything to be factually incorrect against evidence that is mostly damning but still circumstantial? That's actually what has made this investigation so enthralling from the start, because there's so much that paints Winn's account in a dubious light, but of all that can be proved that isn't one person's word against Winn's, for example, estranged family or previous employers, almost nothing alleged has been able to be proved concretely. Until recently, evidence that Winn has lied was, for much of the investigation, not forthcoming. Any single piece of evidence had a he said, she said element to it. And so a smoking gun there was not. But there is one late discovery by the Observer that is as close to one as we're likely to get, because they were able to recover Winn's actual debut novel, which it's evident now was not The Salt Path. That's the plot twist no one really saw coming here. The Salt Path was not her first book, but she told the world that this was her debut. And though on the surface that may sound relatively minor, you do have to take the nuances of the publishing industry into account here. If you're releasing a debut work as a writer, it qualifies you for certain treatment that other authors are not entitled to. For example, there are awards and prize money that are open to you only if this is your first book. Plus, we have to consider that aside from the unique kind of spotlight that touting your book as a debut would lend it, we know that it's untrue in this case, because as of last month, March of 2026, Winn has admitted The Salt Path was not her first book. But this gets even trickier because, having done my research on this a bit more, it is even harder to say that Winn out and out lied, because the novel before The Salt Path, which has a name in Welsh that I will not offend the Welsh by trying to pronounce, was self-published. And the rules for a particular prize that she did win for The Salt Path as her debut book did stipulate they allowed for previously self-published works. Technically, she wasn't breaking any rules, even if it wasn't forthcomingly honest. Again, this indicates something that is not an out-and-out lie, but still a kind of omission that strikes me, at least, as suspicious. A pattern has begun to establish itself of lying by omission. Another reason I wanted to talk about this case specifically is because the ramifications for this are about as uncertain as any part of the veracity of the Salt Path itself. This is not a political scandal. This is a popular memoir written by someone whose face most readers wouldn't recognize if they passed on the street. There is a degree of anonymity here that someone who's, if their face was on TV, for example, wouldn't get. And ultimately, I think that's why there won't be any serious ramifications here. I don't think Penguin will take any further action, and I think Winn's books will continue to sell. Even after the spike in sales that I think the scandal has almost certainly produced. I'm not someone who reads widely in the memoir genre, but I am familiar with it enough to know that people who read it widely are also those who take the trust that readers place in those authors very seriously. We also cannot discount that The Salt Path is just incredibly popular, and work that is popular invariably experiences a certain dilution of scrutiny. Yes, there are readers who will turn on Winn because they feel lied to. But even though you can Google her name and the names of her books and see headlines about the scandal before anything else, ultimately, this book is still going to sell more than most books, by merit of the fact simply that more people have heard of it. I don't think that's right, but I do think that's so. That's the nature of a numbers game. A sad fact, which, unlike so much of this, I think will be proven as fact eventually, is that The Salt Path will continue to be read, because most of those who find themselves with this particular book in their hands won't care.